Hey there, I'm Zach Shirley. We hear a lot about mental health counseling these days, and if you're like me, we have some questions about how it works and what it can do for you. My friend Dom and I had an opportunity to talk about the ins and outs of counseling with Hennessy Lustica, Community School Mental Health Director at Seneca Falls Central School District and a professor at Medaille College. We had a great conversation. Hennessy, welcome to the studio. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us today and answer some questions that we have about counseling. Can we start off with a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do right now?
Yeah, sure. So I was a school counselor for 17 years. Most of that time was in a middle school. I have a little bit of elementary experience and then a little bit of high school experience as well. I've also been a mental health counselor, so a licensed mental health counselor in New York State since 2013. So I've had a private practice where I see kids and families in the private practice. In addition to that, I'm an assistant professor in the clinical mental health program at Medaille University in Buffalo. And my current role, I'm still in the schools too. I'm the community schools mental health director out of the Seneca Falls Central School District.
Oh, so wow.
Lots of different hats.
Nice. Yeah, you got quite a lot on your plate then. Yeah, quite a lot behind you.
Yeah.
So today we're going to ask you some questions about the basics of counseling for people that might not be familiar with the process or what they can expect from counseling itself. Mm-hmm. So first off, I'd like to ask you, what are some things to look for to decide when it's time to reach out and seek counseling, when it's either more than one can handle or it's not just a rough patch in your life?
Yeah, so I'm of the belief that everybody deserves to have a counselor. Everybody deserves to have somebody to talk to that's just their person to talk to. So I think anytime is good to reach out to a counselor. Typically what happens, especially with kids, is they reach out when they're experiencing some sort of distress in their life. So anxiety or depression, they might be sad, they might have a loss of a loved one, school might feel scary all of a sudden. So that's typically when parents will notice a change in a kid's behavior and reach out to get a counselor. But really, they say a good counselor is like a good mechanic. Like, you don't take your car to a mechanic just when something breaks. You have to go for tune-ups all the time. So definitely having somebody to talk to is really great. That's why there's school counselors in schools starting in elementary school. They're there for kids. They teach kids about feelings. They teach them about their emotions and what those feel like in their body. And anybody can go see their school counselor. I would say, in yourself, trying to recognize when you might need to reach out to see somebody. So if you feel different than you normally do, like if you take your baseline and you feel a little sadder than you normally do, or even a little more up than you normally do, you're feeling anxious, any sort of change in your baseline, and it's getting in the way of your life. So, you might be sleeping a little bit more, you might not have an appetite all of a sudden, or vice versa. You might be sleeping not at all and you want to eat all the time. Any sort of change that you see, reach out to somebody to talk to.
So it sounds like the key takeaway there is significant impact to your life.
Yeah.
Your daily life is impacted by, stress factors or other things that are happening. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I like that you said that there's that resource available even in elementary schools.
Yep.
I remember when I was younger, I benefited from a program when I was in elementary school. It was primarily for students that had divorced parents.
Okay.
And that helped me a lot as a kid because I couldn't recognize at that age that there was something wrong, but educators noticed that I was different, and I needed some help like that, So what would typically happen in those types of counseling sessions, not just for elementary, but I guess in general, when you're meeting new patients or...
Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, what would that usually look like?
Yeah, so the place where the counselor is typically a very comfortable office. It could have couches, it could have chairs. I always had beanbag chairs in mine. We have toys because I worked with kids, or a lot of art supplies. In a school, the kid usually comes out of class and just comes and sees the counselor for 15, 20 minutes to talk about what's going on. In private practice, it's a little longer. We usually meet with kids and families for about an hour. And what we do that first session, it's called an intake, which is just a fancy word for just getting to know you. So different counselors do it in different ways. Sometimes counselors write things down. I typically always did it in a conversation. So tell me about you, tell me about your family, what brought you in here today. A lot of times I like to have kids draw a picture of their family, and they put themselves in the middle and all the people that live in their house and their friends and everything around their family. sometimes we play a lot of games. You know, sometimes I get kids that might be shy or might feel uncomfortable, so I always have Uno cards on deck. We might play a game that first time. So it's really about just building rapport with each other and making sure that the kid feels comfortable with me in the space.
Sure. Okay, so what would you say you typically see as a primary reason that children are directed to you, or people would come to you in another capacity? What's like a what compromises the majority of that?
I would say the most prevalent thing I see is anxiety, especially in kind of middle school and older, middle school, high school aged kids. Lots of kids with, you know, like physical symptoms, so all of a sudden they're not able to sleep, or they're not able to eat, or their thoughts are racing all the time in their head. They have somatic symptoms where they feel sick sometimes, so coming in for that a lot of times. A lot of kids whose parents are going through a divorce, I see them, especially from like the beginning of my parents just told me this is happening, all the way through to, okay, now my parents are divorced and I have to go to both households, and kind of helping them to transition through that. Definitely loss too, you know, kids that might lose a grandparent or kids that might lose a parent. I do have a lot of experience with trauma, so kids that were physically abused or sexually abused, I've worked with kids in that capacity as well. So it kind of runs the gamut of everything. I have had quite a few kids that had a fear of throwing up, which I always thought was really interesting, you know? So kind of some phobia stuff too being thrown in there, yeah.
So I mean, kind of piggyback off of that, I guess I'll ask like a little bit more of a controversial question on that.
Sure.
With everything that's kind of going on right now with minors and drag queens and all that stuff, have you had any experience with kind of students or even like from any age coming to you with any concerns regarding anything like that?
Yeah, so I feel very fortunate to be able to sit with kids. I feel very honored to be able to sit with kids when they're in spaces where they need some help. And I've definitely had kids that have come out to me, and I'm the first person that has happened with. And I just follow the kid's lead. What do you want to do with this? How do you want to work through this? I've had students, older students, college students that are transitioning, and I've worked with them and their parents around that. It's also about like helping with resources, what resources are in the community. You know, kids live in the context of their families. So when you're working with kids, you're not just working with a kid. Mm-hmm. You're working with their family, you're working with the school system, you're working with their community. So making sure that, you know, what we do in my office is very effective, but also making sure that kids have a community outside that as well. Yeah.
I'm glad they feel comfortable. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that you have shorter sessions with children and longer for adults. I would suppose that the frequency for adults is probably once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks. What about with the kids? How often do you see them, because it's for shorter periods?
It depends. So it depends on the kid's age as well. So if you're going to have a little kid, like an elementary kid, if you're going to do some play therapy with an elementary age kid, probably 20 to 30 minutes is going to be tops, right? Because you want to make sure you have their attention span in there. Older kids, 45 minutes to an hour, I would say. And then adults is usually an hour as well. It depends on the client. It depends on the issue that they're presented with. It depends on how comfortable they are coming every week. The other thing is kids have a lot going on. You know what I mean? They've got school, they've got sports, they've got their life outside of all of that. So making sure that there's appointments available at strategic times is really important. Having appointments on a weekend is really important. COVID changed everything because we were able to switch to telehealth, which has benefits and lots of drawbacks. But especially for my kids at college, not kids anymore, but when they go to college, I'm still able to do sessions with them over telehealth. So that's been really cool. And those last probably about a half hour to 45 minutes. So it just depends. It depends on what the client wants and what their needs are and their schedule.
Right.
So you said that it's not just like working with the kid, it's like working with their family and everything. Well, if I'm under 18, would I have to tell my parents that I'm going to a counselor, or does the counselor have to get permission from the parents to even see me in the first place?
So that depends on where you are. That's a really good question. So in schools, school counselors are able to see all kids. School counselors are not providing therapy. They're providing support for the kid in school, and they're able to do that. Most schools have like a opt-out in their handbooks that say, I do not want my child to see the school counselor, and the parent can sign that, and then you can't see that kid. We also, in our schools, we have co-located agencies. So we have mental health professionals in our school that work at agencies, but their office is in the school. A couple of those agencies do not need parent permission, and it's because of the funding that they come under. So they can see kids without talking to their parents. I believe it's age 12. If you're over age 12, the kid has to give permission for their parents to see their records. In terms of coming to a private practice with a kid, under 18, I would always work with the parent, and then over 18, I don't work with the parent.
Well,
unless they want me to.
You had said it's not providing therapy. So what is the difference between the two?
Sure. Yeah, so a school counselor, and it was my favorite job ever. I love being a school counselor. So we're trained under kind of a bigger domain than clinical therapy skills. So academics, personal, social, career, and college readiness. So every child under state ed law gets a school counselor, and that school counselor can help with anything in those three buckets, so academic, personal, social, or career. School counselors in their program are not trained to do treatment, like therapy treatment. A lot of school counselors go back to school to get their license, and then they're able to do that. But that doesn't mean that they're not putting interventions in place or helping kids one-on-one. It looks different for every single kid. A lot of times too, school counselors will collaborate with an outside therapist, and they'll be working on goals together for kids. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm going to ask a few more questions real quick.
Sure.
So you had said that when a parent signs a kid up for school, they can put in there that, they don't want them to see the counselor.
Yeah.
Are there any circumstances where that could be overridden? Because
yeah, if there's a crisis. So if a kid is going to hurt themselves or hurt somebody else, or if there was some sort of awful crisis in a school, then of course the counselor can intervene during that immediate time. But the counselor then cannot bring the kid down over and over to talk about that. I have never in 20 years had somebody sign off that they don't want their kid to see the counselor, but it's definitely an option.
Okay. As far as kind of regarding not crises as much, but as far as bullies and stuff goes, how do, because in my own experience, I've seen a lot of the times where when I was younger in middle school and everything, and I got bullied, and when I would retaliate, I was the one receiving the punishments. And I remember I had gotten put into special ed classes all because I had an angry outburst due to getting bullied and everything when I was younger. So I was wondering what kind of has it changed basically,
Yeah, so each school has a code of conduct that they have to follow. The school counselor, and I say this a lot when I teach counselors too, your job is to support the bully and the kid getting bullied. You have to do both, because both of those kids are on your caseload. But schools have a code of conduct that they have to follow around discipline. A lot of the things that we're doing in schools now are restorative in nature, so restorative practices, a lot of community building circles, a lot of repairing harm through talking with each other. If the code of conduct is broken and a consequence has to happen, the consequence still has to happen, because that's on the school side. School counselors don't do discipline, but that's on the school side. But what we have taught administrators and taught parents and teachers is, okay, if something happens, kids are kids developmentally, but we need to bring them together so they can learn to talk to each other and understand that somebody was harmed and how not to do something different. So it probably looks different now, is my guess, from what you experienced. I know bullying is a big one, especially in middle school. Think about going back to middle school.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be in middle school, right? It's really hard there. So really building empathy in kids, I think, and if you have a community of kids that come together and talk to each other all the time, then they're less likely to do harm to each other. If you know somebody's story, you're less likely to do harm to that person. So school counselors are really integral in helping to build that community within the classroom, build it between teachers and kids, build it with parents, so everybody understands each other's stories and harm is less likely to occur. So hopefully there's a preventative side to it, and then of course there's the responsive side to it if something happens.
Gotcha. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious, you mentioned that with COVID it brought about telehealth, and it seems to have gone into everything.
Yep.
Not just mental health services, but even general care and general practitionery You know, I know a lot of doctors' offices have telehealth with LPNs, RNs, and such. What would you say is different now with telehealth, and especially as a lot more people are becoming aware of these services? There's a huge demand
Yeah.
for seeing therapists and counselors. Can you go over a little bit of the drawbacks or advantages that you see? Do patients open up more
Sure.
freely over media or compared to in person?
Yeah, I think it depends. It's definitely access, right? There's more access when you can call a therapist on your phone, or you have your computer in your house and you're able to connect that way. So that probably opens the door for a lot more people. Because of COVID, insurance policies changed and telehealth was able to be billed for insurance, so that made a huge shift to that happening. With my older kids that I work with, or kids at college, it's been really helpful because as long as they're in New York State, my license still allows me to be their therapist or counselor. So they might go to a different school, but I'm still able to connect with them over telehealth, which is good. Some of the drawbacks are, you know, being in person is different. It's just different. It's more familiar sometimes. It could be more comfortable. I think rapport is sometimes built quicker when you're in person. And as counselors, we're looking at all sorts of things. So we're like scanning all the time. We're listening to what you're saying, but we're also looking at your body language. We're looking at how you respond to me in the room, right? What makes you happy? What makes you, you know, are you withdrawn? Like all of that kind of body language stuff that you can miss over telehealth. The other thing with kids, especially when they were home during COVID, unfortunately, not every kid's house is a happy place to be, you know. What we saw were CPS calls plummeted, but that didn't mean that domestic violence wasn't happening. That didn't mean that abuse wasn't happening. Kids didn't have a safe place to go. There was nobody to tell, because usually CPS comes from schools. So when you work with a kid through telehealth, you don't know who else is in the room. Right, so that can be a drawback sometimes, especially if a kid is in a dangerous situation. So I think it's a double-edged sword.
Right. Now that's a really interesting point. I've never really heard that point brought up before. You know, in talking about patient privacy, we talked
Yeah.
about parents being able to access their records, like you said.
Yep.
Can students choose to bring somebody with them
Yeah.
to sessions, like if they have a trusted adult that they want to maybe help them work through, or can they bring like a friend?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah. So in my world, yes, especially with kids in schools, I always let them bring a friend, because it's, you know, kids don't go anywhere without a friend in school. So yeah, and the more people that I can, you know, the more kids that I can help, then that's better. In private practice, absolutely. Like they're driving the bus in private practice, so they can bring anyone they want into the room. A lot of times I would do the session with the kid, and then we'd bring the parent in after, and I would say, you know, I'm not going to share anything that you don't want me to share, what is okay to share, what is not okay to share. My job is also to empower the child to share with their parents when they want to, you know what I mean, and to provide a safe space and a kind of a mediator for them to do that. So for me, yes, bring as many folks as you want in.
So with private practice, you had said, so in the schools they can bring a friend. Obviously, some stranger can't just come in from outside the school. But like private practice, like kind of like after hours or outside of the school and everything. How does it work as far as if a kid wants to go to a counseling or therapy session, and they want a supportive person that isn't their parents but is also like an adult? Have you ever experienced any kind of like legal issues regarding that at all?
I
or?
haven't. I think it would depend on the age of the child, right? I'm not sure. I've never even experienced like legalities around that, or had anybody like say, no, you can't bring somebody in the room with you.
Gotcha. I just
Yeah.
asking because I have family that parents aren't always as supportive
Right.
with, you know, children like struggling
Yeah.
like inside the home and everything. And, you know, as like somebody that I care about, I want to make sure that they're getting kind of
Sure.
the help and everything that they need.
Yeah.
But it's hard to, when they're under 18, to be like, you know, I can't just trump the
No.
parent. So
And
I was
there's
wondering.
a payment piece, right? Because insurance has to be billed, and
Yeah.
there's that piece as well that makes it kind of complicated. I've had a lot of like grandparents come in with them, or like cousins, usually immediate family, or like
Yeah.
family kind of thing.
But I mean, if it is immediate family, they would still probably need permission from the parents because they're under like that insurance and everything.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah.
Now we touched a little bit on, privacy of the patient, you know, not only with the disclosure of the records and things. What about privacy between patient and therapist or counselor? I think there's this idea that, you know, when you're in there, you have to tell them everything, or you have to totally be open to everything. But it's okay to say that you don't want to talk about certain things.
Yes.
Do you have anything to say about that? Like, you know, not withholding from your therapist, but just finding it in your own time, maybe.
There are certain times where confidentiality does come up between client and therapist. So there's 3 times where confidentiality has to be broken. So if the client says they're going to hurt themselves, hurt someone else, or somebody is hurting them. And I'm very upfront with kids about that, especially like during our intake session. Like, I can tell you a little bit about my role and about the things that I'm able to keep in this room and not keep in this room. Counselors and therapists are not keeping secrets, right? And we are, especially if you're working with kids, you're mandated reporters. So making sure if some sort of allegation of abuse or something comes up where a kid is you know, suicidal or something like that, then confidentiality does have to be broken.
I see. Okay. We might have talked about this earlier, but I was curious about this. You mentioned that the ones that work in the schools themselves, you said they're not therapists. What's the difference between their role and their title and a therapist per se? Because there's a lot of terminology that gets tossed around.
Yeah.
But what's the actual difference between the two for anyone that might not know?
Yeah, so you've within your like behavioral health or mental health teams in a school, you have school counselors, K-8, you have school psychologists, K-8, and then you have school social workers. And they're all trained in a different way. We all collaborate together and work together, but we all bring a different skill set to the table. So the school counselors, like I said, have those 3 buckets: academic, career, social, emotional, that they're working on. School psychologists are really around, they can do counseling, but they also do educational testing and assessment. So you spoke about special ed earlier. So if a kid is a special education student, they get evaluated by the school psychologist to do that, and their degree allows them to do that. And then the school social worker, you know, they're definitely trained in more of a therapy role, but they're also trained in connection and referral. So a lot of working with outside agencies and working with families, and a lot of systems work that they're trained in. So I think it gets very mixed up when you're in a school. It's just the person that you're talking to, you know, and we're all trained in a similar way, but we're all trained in a different way too. So the key is to collaborate with each other and make sure that our areas of expertise are there to help the kid. So like as a kid, you could talk to your counselor and your psychologist and your social worker. You don't have to pick one, right? You could talk to all those people are there to support you. They just come from a different lens. There's also co-located therapists in schools. So this would be, especially in the schools that I work in, so this would be an agency or like a mental health clinic that partners with the school and puts a therapist in the building, and they have a caseload and they're billing insurance, but the building is their office, basically. That therapist needs parent permission. That therapist totally abides by HIPAA. That would be if like you were going to another office, it's just the office is in the school. So that person would be doing treatment as opposed to kind of prevention and overall support and interventions and testing like the other folks in the school.
So as far as areas of expertise though, what can a counselor do for me? You know, for example, if I was like super stressed or anxious about money, obviously you guys can't just give me money. So, you know, what would be your role in all of that?
Yeah, so it depends on what orientation the counselor has. So for me, I do a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy. So let's think about your thoughts, let's think about your feelings, let's think about your behaviors, identify what your thought patterns are, identify any distortions in those thought patterns, really teach you how feelings feel in your body, give you some coping strategies around that, give you some homework to practice it, and that's how we would do that. There's all different kinds of treatment modalities. I'm also, you know, trained in child-centered play therapy, so that would be with little kids. I'm trained in child-parent psychotherapy, so that would be with kids and their caregivers. It just depends on who your clients are and what your training comes with. You know, a lot of counselors have training in substance abuse. I do not. That's not my area of expertise. A lot of counselors have areas of expertise in grief and loss, that kind of stuff. So it just depends on what issue you're coming to the table with and who's going to be the best fit for you. It's also the responsibility of the counselor, if they're not the best fit for you, to refer you to somebody who's going to be the best fit for you.
All right, so we've talked a lot about what counseling looks like and how we get there. Now, on the other side of the coin, what are some signs that it's starting to work for you? Maybe is there any sort of quantifiable or qualitative results that you can kind of use to gauge the effectiveness or the trajectory that it's taking so that you can eventually stand on your own 2 feet again?
Sure. People start to feel better, which is good. Usually when we do an intake, we talk about symptoms. So, what symptoms are you having in your body? What about your sleep, your eating patterns, all of that kind of stuff? And we set up goals with our clients about, how you want to feel after 3 weeks, after 6 weeks, whatever the time frame is going to be. So we always refer back to those goals. So if people are reporting out that, their anxiety has decreased, their appetite has increased, they're exercising again, like that kind of stuff, it's very individualized. There's no set time on it. It depends on the person. It depends on the issue that they've come in with as well. But journaling can help, I think, really teaching clients to recognize in themselves when they feel better and when they don't feel better. I use a feeling thermometer a lot from 1 to 10. How are you feeling 1 to 10? Having folks do that at home too. And then making sure, that people have a community to go to, a support community to go to. We wouldn't just kick somebody out of therapy and say, oh, you're done, So really spending a lot of time during the termination phase, it's called, talking about what's next for that person. And then the door's always open, of course, and it's definitely a mutual agreement to either continue with therapy or not continue with therapy. And the client's always driving the bus again. They can say, no, I don't want to do this anymore, or I need to do this twice a week, or whatever. They're the ones that are in charge of that.
I think that's amazing that the more we dig, the more we find, and this whole series is all about learning more about this massive, massive topic with so many layers. And like you said just now earlier, breaking the shame, and encouraging people to go and explore these avenues to help themselves, So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And I think we've learned a lot right now. And, we appreciate the work that you do. So thank you very much for that, Hennessy.
Thank you.
Our conversations with Hennessy gave us a deeper understanding of the counseling process and how it might differ based on your age. Keep watching for a list of resources that will help you learn more about counseling services in your community and look for opportunities to have your own conversations about mental health.